This time on Poll Hub, as we head into the busy holiday season and the prospect of having to fly home and talk politics with your crazy uncle over turkey, 3 segments to help you get through. First, the difference between active and passive news consumers. Turns out it's less about how you get your news and more about if you get your news at all. Then, we turn to the convenience of biometric scans. It's not just unlocking your phone with a quick look. If you're traveling by air this season, even the TSA will be happy to wave you through once they scan your face. Are we trading convenience for privacy? And finally, the single most lopsided fun fact ever. It's one of those you can use to change the subject over Thanksgiving dinner when it gets really uncomfortable. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Julia Tartaglia.
And I am Lee Miringoff.
So we've talked a lot on the show over many years now about the media and politics, especially this combination, partly because I think it's what a lot of us are interested in, but partly it's because it has so much to do with our modern politics. If it wasn't for the media, I don't think politics would look anything like what it looks like in this country or in the Western world. We ran across a study that's really interesting in the way that we've been talking about media and politics. Global Strategies Group is a political consulting group that we've known about for a long time. I've interviewed them over many years as a reporter. They work with Democrats and labor unions. And Will Jordan is the vice president of research there and was co-author of a report that is about news consumers. And it's called Engaging Passive News Consumers. And that's the distinction here, passive and active news consumers. And we wanted to talk to him about that. So, Will Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Longtime fan of you all and everything you all do. So long-time listener, first-time caller, I guess.
No, very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I like that. That's a throwback, though, I think. So one of the central things in your report here is that it's important to distinguish between active news consumers and passive news consumers. Is that different from people who consume news at all and people who simply ignore it? Because we know that there are people who really don't pay any attention to news at all. Is that a real distinction, or are we relabeling them the same but just with different words?
Yeah, well, let me take a step back and lay out how we separated these two groups in the context of the survey. In the study, we have this distinction that you've mentioned between active and passive news consumers, and it's about how people get news and information about politics in particular, but also news generally. We asked them a simple question, which is, which of the following better describes how you get news and about current affairs and politics? News and information about current affairs and politics. And the options are that you seek it out or it comes to you. So it's this simple question that distinguishes in the way that people are getting news. And we call the people who are seeking out news the active consumers, and the people who are letting it come to them the passive news consumers. We started asking this a couple years ago in a variety of different sort of media consumption contexts. I think Pew has asked a similar question in the past as well. And it just revealed something very interesting that I think does overlap with a lot of what you were talking about, the amount of attention people pay to news, some questions that have been asked and been relevant to politics for many, many years. But I think has become more interesting and relevant to the point of the study we did, particularly as social media and these algorithmic platforms have started playing a bigger and bigger role in the way that people get political information. Essentially, computer algorithms that are predicting what people want before they say it, and helping to deliver people things that they're interested in. And the other interesting thing here is just that it's close to a 50-50 divide. It's more like 60-40 active passive. But what's notable to us as political pollsters and researchers is that it's actually not a red-blue divide in the traditional sense. It's interesting in that the active audience includes hardcore Democrats and MAGA Republicans. It includes MSNBC viewers and Fox viewers. Those are all in common in that they're sort of actively engaged with politics and seeking out news. And then, I'm sure that most of the viewers in your podcast, we are all active news consumers. So this is sort of us versus them that applies across parties. And the passive side is younger, it's more working class, it's more independent, less political, more pragmatic. They're much less politically engaged in the traditional sense as well. It's an important distinction, and I think becomes relevant, as we'll discuss, for political communication when you consider the traditional mode of reaching people is like running ads alongside the local news.
Let me throw a number from your report out there, and then Lee, jump in. So among the active news consumers, 38% are very engaged in political information, 40% somewhat engaged, so 78%, 3/4, pretty active. The flip side, passive news consumers, 51% disengaged, over half just not engaged at all, 33% are somewhat engaged, only 16% are very engaged. So Lee, that kind of sets the stage. I mean, there is a real difference between these people.
Yeah, and when I was reading the report, I felt that this was almost the best case scenario, if that's possible. The report was issued this year in 25. I'm thinking that the data may have been collected on the heels of the 24 presidential, which may have been a time where some of the passive were brought into the system, at least temporarily. Two other points. One, for obvious reasons, though, given what you do for a living, it was of registered voters, not population as a whole. Again, I would think the registered voters at least are that much more active than the people who aren't.
It could be worse, Lee, if it was all American adults.
Almost certainly.
Yeah. And so I think it's the best case. And the third best case was when you talk about the algorithms and how what's being peddled to us as opposed to what we're seeking, and how that is blurring the line between people who are trying to stay informed and the people who are tuning out. So I thought there was the combination of when it was done, who was interviewed, and this sort of algorithm over the whole discussion. How much worse would this be if you did it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to some, deeper questions about who this audience is and how they behave politically. But I think, the way that you saw 2024 play out and some of the audiences that swung the most and the impact of issues like inflation and things that were more likely to be present for apolitical people, I think it's a key to understanding a lot of what's going on with politics today and what separates, people that are following closely from really the rest of the population. And I think based on what we've seen, because we've asked this question not only in a registered voter context, but also in a likely voter context. We don't often do all adults polls just because of the nature of our job. But my intuition, and based on the difference between likely and registered, is that you'd see kind of a sliding scale with the passive news consumption being higher and higher the further you get from sort of high propensity voters, because that's the other dimension here of political engagement. Political engagement correlates with likelihood of voting. And so ultimately less political, less politically active ends up overlapping quite a lot with the passive audience, and so that grows. That being said, I think the important thing is that to remember is that this is still a huge segment even among a likely voter audience, and we find that if you look specifically at persuadable voters, the ones most likely to move in reaction to political communication, then this passive audience grows in its share, and if you combine it with passive and a category of disengaged, you've got most persuadable voters are either passive or in some way less engaged politically.
So, Will, is that because when you talk about active news consumers and there's MSNBC viewers and Fox viewers, I mean, active news consumers have picked their teams and they're not going to change? Is that fair? I
think it's a mix. I think that's a big part of it. Some of them are, strong people who describe themselves as strong Democrats, people who describe themselves as MAGA Republicans, which is like, I'm not just affiliated with one side or the other. I'm like a fan, I'm out there, I'm going to the games, I've got a season tickets, but there is a whole, probably another half of the party coalitions that are in a looser affiliation with the party. And I think, those remain very important voters, and they're, not as likely to be on some of these sort of political places. I think to your point though, like the people who are following it or going to every game, to extend the metaphor, they're both, more committed in terms of their identity, but they're also more exposed to political information. And so the people who are active news consumers, regardless of whether or not they're strong partisans, they're going to be seeing, the latest information about the major political candidates when they watch the news. So I think my intuition is that to the extent that they then see an ad in between segment A and segment B, there's just more competition for persuasion at that point. The kind of magic of a passive news consumer overreaching somebody who's not already watching all this political information or absorbing all this political information is that you get a quieter, less partisan space to reach them and essentially potentially more leverage to persuade in that context.
I think what I was really interested about when I was reading this was coming from my perspective. So people my age, specifically college students, aren't really active consumers in the sense that they follow news accounts online. Obviously everyone my age spends a lot of time on social media, probably a lot more than they should. But when you think of these young people who just end up stumbling across news on their feeds, what types of stories do you think they're coming across, or sources specifically? And then what do you think they're likely to see from that, and what kinds of information is missing when they just stumble across it on their feeds?
It's a great question. I mean, and one thing I'll note as well that we found in this research was that passive news consumers are also less likely to verify information. They're taking it and they're not digging as deeply as others. And I think just, intuitively and based on, some of this research and what we saw in 2024, I think what you'll see is that people who are passive news consumers that are just encountering it are probably going to encounter things that are more connected to cultural signifiers and also just, general economic, realities. I think the fact of life for young people in 2024 was dealing with the high cost of living, the price of gas, the price of groceries. That's something you see whether you're on social media, whether you're watching the news or not. You see it in the store, you see it in the street. So I think those things and those stories are going to be bigger drivers. And I think in some ways what we've seen over the last 12 months of politics, 12 plus months, is that the candidates that can align with, addressing those concerns are more likely to win this persuadable audience that's less engaged. And that really over-indexes with young people who are less politically committed and are more likely to be absorbing news passively. They are really, people who are potentially persuaded by somebody who has a real strong message on these affordability issues that saturate their feeds.
What do we make of, like in New York City mayoralty, like the Mamdani factor, where he obviously struck a chord? Was it reaching people in interesting ways and getting younger folks in, or was his message about affordability? Is that what resonated? Because you're sort of setting both of those things. It's not just the process of reaching people, but it's also what the content of the message is. So I was wondering, when you look at Mamdani in New York, how do you react to that phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a relevant consideration. Obviously, there's a question of whether you have the right political message when you throw it into an ad, and then you throw in paid communication. But I think when you look at some of Mamdani's videos, for example, I think what's distinctive about many of them is that they don't initially even feel political. And I think one of the things that he found he was able to do as a political communicator on these vertical video or whatever apps, some of the horizontal video, YouTube and TikTok and all that, was produce content that people wanted to watch, that I think did speak to these same concerns, that I think does drive some of this virality, because it's just, these are not political people. They care about stuff that affects their lives, and creating political communication that speaks to that is important. But then also having a conversation with voters that's not necessarily political, in addition to the political stuff, I think is key for having that ability to communicate in that way. And frankly, I think you saw it in 2024 in many ways with some of the stuff. Trump did the stunt at McDonald's and stuff like that. Those were viral moments that didn't feel like political communication in the traditional
So a little bit more authenticity.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, don't give away your trade secrets unless you want to, but what are you advising clients based on this?
Well, I think we've done this study and it's publicly available. And I think it's pretty clear to me that this is an audience that, as you're thinking about media plans and how you're going to communicate to voters ahead of an election, understanding where you can find not just persuadable and swing voters in the traditional sense, but also this specific audience of passive news consumers is a dimension to politics that I think is increasingly important. And I think you'll find that certain mediums, whether it's TV versus social versus YouTube and everything in between, streaming, potentially over or under index in this passive consumer audience. And so figuring out the ways to really reach these people, both in terms of the medium and the message, is, I think, increasingly important.
Julia, let's give you the last question, since one of the things that Will mentioned at the beginning was how the folks who are not terribly engaged in news tend to over-index as younger voters, and you're that generation. So let's give you the last word.
I think I'll just ask, obviously, I think younger passive consumers are more vulnerable to misinformation. But do you think it's that, or do you think they're just less motivated to verify exactly what they're seeing? And do you think the fact-checking gap looks different for Gen Z specifically?
Interestingly, as I recall, the fact-checking gap was less pronounced for young people. I think that there's a weird dynamic where I think that the least likely to verify are the older passive news consumers who are used to a more traditional experience of the media, where you can take information and move forward with it. But I actually think Gen Z are relatively savvy. And I think one of the things that I've not spoken to is that the research did speak to what causes people to trust media and when they encounter something online. And the top thing is a bit frustrating on some level is just essentially the authentic feel, whether somebody feels trustworthy when you watch a video. And I think my instinct is that Gen Z and younger millennials and all the rest of people that have lived online for a long period have a kind of practiced instinct for, here's a communicator that is trustworthy on some level that not necessarily all voters have developed as they're newer to some of these modes of communication. So it's a kind of subtlety that's interesting in that, like, I don't know necessarily that younger people are more prone to misinformation, though they're definitely on some of these platforms more where a lot of that stuff's floating around.
Better BS detectors because they've had to train them for longer, maybe. Yeah. All right. Will Jordan, Vice President of Research at the Global Strategies Group. Great report, Engaging Passive News Consumers. As you pointed out, this is not a trade secret. You've put it on the website. And I think, look, Republican consulting groups are going to be doing the same thing, talking to their clients in the same way. But it is a really interesting way, I think, for all of us to try and understand as politics has become more like sports. I think that was actually a good analogy you used, how people who aren't into sports and aren't into politics are still part of the story. And they're still part of this country, and they're still part of politics, and they need to be engaged, and you got to figure out how to do that. So thanks for joining us. This is great.
Well, fingerprint and facial recognition are common biometric tools. However, support for use of biometrics varies depending on use case, and specific concern exists in relation to racial bias and surveillance. Here to further discuss this topic is Dr. Gideon Christian, who is the University Excellence Research Chair in AI and Law at the University of Calgary. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. So let's just start from the very basics. When we discuss biometric technology, what's the line between acceptability and unacceptability for people?
So biometric, there are various forms of biometric identification technology. You have facial recognition. There's also fingerprints. There's iris scan, DNA, among others. But one thing among the various biometric technology is that one of the most dominant biometric technology is facial recognition technology. But curiously also, facial recognition technology also happens to be the worst among all of the biometric technology, especially when it comes to identification. So in terms of acceptability, I think the acceptability will depend on what context is it being used. There are contexts or environments where people may not really have much qualms with regards to the deployment of this technology, but there are also some other environments where the deployment of or use of this technology may be deemed to be unreasonably invasive by individuals. So I think the question will depend on what environments are you using it and who are the target audience.
That's a really great point, Dr. Christian. So when we take a look at some of the numbers, according to a 2024 Ipsos poll, 78% of Americans, they support the use of biometrics when it comes to TSA and transportation security. And nearly all Americans, 92% air travelers, about the same proportion, 95%, agree that verifying traveler identity is an important measure taken by this agency to protect the flying public. But, I thought that there was some other interesting data that we found where when it comes to the environment, such as the workplace, where Americans are much less likely to support the use of biometrics. So when we think about the workplace, according to a Pew Research survey, 70% of Americans oppose the use of facial recognition to analyze employees' facial expressions. 52% oppose tracking how often workers breaks, and 35% oppose automatically tracking the attendance of their employees. So it makes sense in terms of this concept of when things are hitting close to home and when it's almost as if there's some type of retaliation or you're holding people accountable in different contexts. But even beyond that, there is a racial component to this in terms of targeting and in terms of surveillance. Maybe you could speak a little bit to that point.
Yeah, so that's very important statistics or data there. Like I noted earlier, the environment in which this tool is deployed have some impact on acceptability. For example, most of the cell phones we have today have facial recognition technology. I have never ever met somebody who is complaining that their cell phone has facial recognition technology. They use it confidently without any complaints, right? Nobody is opposed. I've never seen anybody opposed to that. There might be some few, but not majority out there, I think they do love to unlock their phone using their face. Now, you talk about acceptability in the context of, airport screening, right? Yeah, that's also another area some people kind of seems to think there's reasonableness in, deploying this technology. And why is this the case? Because there is a measure of trade-off people are willing to accommodate. And as somebody who travel, I think the area I hate most about my air travel is the airport screening. I am going on a flight that probably take me 1 hour in terms of flight duration. I have to arrive at the airport 2 hours before my flight to go through screening. I have to take off my shoe, take off my jacket, take off my laptop and everything, right? So come to think about it, if all it takes for me to just put all this stress aside is just show my face to some biometric tool, and then it scans me and identifies me as Professor Christian and not as a terrorist or someone who is a threat to national security. That is a trade-off, I might be willing to accommodate in terms of the efficiency in that environment. But ask me, how often do you travel? Or ask the average American or not American, how often do they travel? Maybe Thanksgiving and Christmas and occasionally on vacation, maybe 3 times a year. So if you have to, accept that discomfort of, subjecting yourself to this biometrics technology 3 times in a year, that is a trade-off people will be willing to accommodate. But that is different when you now have to deploy this tool in an environment where I work 9 to 5, 5 out of 7 days in a week, which kind of makes it a constant feature of my life. And not just that, in the context of the airport scenario, that image is taken, that comparison is made, I'm cleared. Probably maybe in another 2 or 3 months, that data is discarded. That data probably will most likely not come back to haunt me in terms of workplace review or in some other consequences, really. But when it comes to use of facial recognition technology in workplace, there's much more to it in terms of invasiveness than, comparing it with airports or cell phone use, because the record gathered there, it's used in determining my productivity, it's used in determining my evaluation. I mean, it could actually make a difference between my being promoted or demoted or fired or retained. So because of the serious implication that arises from the use of this technology in workplace, it is not surprising then, going by the data that you have there, that whereas people might be willing to accommodate this tool within the airport scenario, they'll be less reluctant to accommodate it in a workplace environment because of, another reason also is the power imbalance in workplace environment between the employer and the employee. So there are many reasons why that data is understandable, why people really are opposed to the use or deployment of this technology in their workplace.
What's the danger? That you talked about how we open our phones with our faces all the time, but biometrics is also DNA, it's thumbprints, it's eye scans. When I go through Clear at the airport, they have an eye scan of me. What's the danger to me or any individual of having this out there, this data out there, this biometric data out there and potentially accessible by others?
So the issue is this, like I noted earlier, facial recognition technology is the worst of all the biometrics. That's one problem. Now, I haven't even gone to the racial components, which is even more disturbing, but let's just stand on that general premise that this is the worst of all the biometric technologies. That's one. Secondly, the ease with which faces or facial images could be obtained. Fingerprints, it's an aspect of biometrics. But for you to get my fingerprint, you will probably have to either get it willingly in the sense that I volunteer the fingerprints to you, or you will probably have to overpower me and subdue me to get it. Or maybe get it from some database where it has been stored, and that database will be very rare. Maybe probably have to go through, if I have police record, probably go through the police, or maybe through passport. So it's very rare to obtain my fingerprint. DNA equally the same difficulty with DNA. But when it comes to facial image, that is one of the most easiest biometric you can obtain. I can basically, with my cell phone on a public transit, take your picture without you knowing it,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? I'm probably in a Zoom meeting with you without you knowing it. I can take a screenshot of your face. It's just that so easy to obtain facial image. And when it comes to developing facial recognition technology, the same ease also goes to gathering biometric data or facial images to develop this technology. And Clearview showed us how easy that could be done. All you just basically do is, Facebook images of people and social media images of people, collecting them without their notice, and then using it to develop a biometric image. So you can see the invasive nature of this tool, of this technology, the ease with which you can obtain biometric or facial images of people, and the intrusive nature. It's actually one thing that makes it quite different from, other biometric.
Yeah. My question I have, I understand the point you're making here, and I think it's a very important one. How recent has this technology come on the scene? I mean, I know we've had certain events internationally that have, encouraged the use of some of these technologies. My question is twofold. How recent are the technologies? And also, does AI enter into the picture in terms of future benefits and risks?
So in terms of facial recognition technology, I think that technology has been there for a while, for a long while. It's just that recently, because the technology kind of became easily accessible in recent time.
Okay.
And I think one particular incident that drew attention to facial recognition technology and even made it popular in a very notorious way was the Clearview AI scandal. Before Clearview AI, very few people knew about facial recognition technology.
Yeah.
I think Clearview AI scandal was one scandal that actually kind of, put
Broke
this
through.
technology.
Yeah.
It put the technology in the headline, and people kind of begin to know, oh, something like this did exist. And talking about AI, of course, AI, it's an essential part of this technology because this is basically a technology that operates with, it's basically trained on AI, basically analyzing facial images using artificial intelligence technology, whereby it's able to map unique facial characteristics of individual, convert them to mathematical data, and then makes that comparison. So AI technology of basically kind of added to the notoriety of this tool because it kind of made the tool predominant, made it also highly accurate and easily to develop and also easy to deploy too.
You mentioned that the use of biometrics to perhaps racially profile is a greater danger. To what extent have we seen this happen? And moving forward, what can be done to safeguard this type of bias in the future?
Thanks. I think one of the biggest threats to one of the biggest threats from facial recognition today is the threat it poses to darker skinned individual or racialized communities. And there have been great deal of research out there that has basically well documented the accuracy rate of facial recognition technology. And this research gets to show that this technology has about 99.2% accuracy rate in recognizing white male faces. That is actually close to perfect accuracy rate in recognizing white male faces. But when it comes to darker skin faces, the accuracy rate drops. The worst being darker skin females or Black women, where the technology has been shown to have some 35% error rate in recognizing darker skinned females or darker skinned women. And why is this an issue? Well, it is a big issue because of increasing use of this technology, especially by law enforcement personnel, right? If you look at cases, well-publicized cases of forced arrest in the United States arising from police use of facial recognition technology, one common trend among all these well-documented cases is that almost all the individuals involved were darker skinned individuals or black people. The worst, of course, being the case of the case of Miss Portia Woodruff, a black woman, 8 months pregnant black woman who was arrested for, of all crime, was arrested for carjacking. And it turned out that this was a grave mistake by facial recognition technology, which matched the face of this woman to some other culprit who was actually responsible for that crime. So that's one big problem when it comes to deploying this tool in among racialized community. Now, I mean, coming from, I have actually looked at this in the context of Canada. In Canada, there are no highly publicized cases of forced arrests arising from police use of facial recognition technology, as you do have in the United States, where it is documented. I do not know the reason for this, but one clue is the fact that when Clearview AI was used by police department in Canada here, it was used without legal justification or even in-house clearance. So this was basically police department purchasing, test, or trying these tools without any clearance. So there's no record of them using this tool because they were secretly using it. And my argument is that a police department that is smart enough to secretly deploy this tool will equally be smart enough to conceal any evidence arising from their use, any evidence of forced arrest arising from their use of this tool. So I'm not saying that such cases of forced arrest might not have existed. It's just that it is not documented, or if it is documented, maybe probably hidden somewhere where we have not been able to see. But one area where my research in Canada has shown concerning use with regards to facial recognition technology is in the context of immigration enforcement. And here we have seen cases of individuals who entered Canada and sought refugee status or asylum. And following their successful claim of refugee status, many years after, you see the government department or the immigration department coming to revoke their refugee status based on the fact that their face, maybe the face of the individual, was matched to some other individual in the immigration database. So how were you able to match this? Of course, facial recognition technology. But one disturbing thing about all the cases I have studied in Canada, in this context, in immigration context, is that almost all the individuals where the immigration authority has sought to revoke their refugee or asylum status based on evidence from facial recognition technology, they are individuals from darker skinned community, from Black people, the same community where the tool has been shown to have its worst error rates. So in US, where you have in the US increasing cases of forced arrest by police departments arising from facial recognition technology, in Canada, what we see is increasing cases of refugee status revocation by immigration departments arising from use of facial recognition technology. And in each of these two cases, American and US, the culprits have always been darker skinned individuals, Black people, and which I think is concerning. It is concerning because this is the same community where this tool has been shown to have its worst error rate.
Yeah.
Then you begin to ask yourself if this tool is actually ready for prime time within that community.
This is certainly important information for everyone to have, but unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it here. Dr. Gideon Christian of the University of Calgary, we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
So take a quick break from your preparations for your tomorrow's dinner, and the CBS News 2013 question for the fun fact this week was, do you think Thanksgiving would be better in the fall, where it is right now, spring, summer, or winter? And as Jay indicated at the top, this is lopsided. Fall, 93%, keep it right where it is. Spring and summer, 2% each. Winter gets 1%, and don't know edges out winter with 2%. No, not much controversy here. People are content, maybe because they're looking forward to it. But anybody have any objections to Thanksgiving occurring in the fall? Everybody likes this.
No objections here.
How about if we move New Year's Eve to August?
Oh, no, I'd like that. It would be warm out. No, that would be good.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, this was asked in November, so I do wonder if you asked it
Yeah.
another time of year, if they might think different. But there are a few seasons, I think, or a few holidays that are so totally linked with a time of year. And Christmas is, although if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, if you've ever lived in the Southern Hemisphere, Christmas is actually, in Australia, you go to the beach, right? And Christmas in Miami or whatever, it's, you don't think of snow and stuff. But Thanksgiving is just, the food is all rooted in the fall. The decorations are all fall leaves and pumpkins and all that. I think it is probably the most seasonal holiday. So it does not surprise me. 93%, which, we couldn't get 93% to agree on anything. 93% agree, yep, leave it where it is. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I wouldn't even think to move it. I mean, I don't think sometimes we have controversies over whether we should celebrate something or not. And that has to do with sometimes political and sociological arguments. And look, we would have to move football if we moved it
I
into
knew
the
that was.
summer.
I thought that would actually be the first thing, Lee, that you said, was that how can you have Thanksgiving in summer? You couldn't have a football game to watch. But Sylvia and Julia, do either of you think Thanksgiving should be at another time of year?
No, I have very strong feelings that it should stay exactly where it is. I feel like it's a good break too for kids in school and in college. It's like making it to the final Thanksgiving stretch, and then you go home for a couple of days, and then you have like a couple more weeks of school, and then you go home for the holidays. So I think it's important that it stays where it is.
And Julia, that's about what you're going to do in the next 24 hours.
Yeah, I'm on
right?
the same page as Sylvia and everyone else. I think keep it where it is. You think Thanksgiving colors, you think orange, red, that's fall colors anyway. And then, like Sylvia said, like it's a good break for college students to go home, see their families, a nice, good meal. Yeah.
And who wants Brussels sprouts in the summer? Actually, I like Brussels sprouts in the summer. Never mind, I retract that.
What happens to Black Friday?
There you go. You got that problem. There's more problems caused by moving this than by keeping it as it is, and people aren't upset with the way it is. And so we're not going to be upset either. So
Nope.
Have a very happy Thanksgiving, and we'll catch you on the other side.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers,
Julia Tartaglia,
Cassie Connors, Sylvia Weiser, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.